While trying to come up with an opening for this specific video, I couldn't figure out a good punchline. All the jokes felt low-hanging because they lingered on a very obvious fruit for the topic at hand. Oranges. I bet you thought I was going to say bananas, but aren't you glad I didn't? In today's humble opinion, some introductions are in order for My Friend Pedro. I know the question on everyone's minds, and the answer is yes, he is my friend. Contrary to my very best self-deprecating humor, I do have those. Pedro and I go way back. I even helped him get elected as class president in high school. Everyone voted for him. Some say this election was dynamite. He prefers bananas. But I'm not here to brag, and I'm not big on reminiscing, so with that out of the way, I'd like to politely redirect everyone's attention to the game we're actually here for. My Friend Pedro is the self-proclaimed full-throttle gun ballet, and while I'm not capable of parsing any hidden technicalities on what qualifies a ballet in its definition of a ballet, I'm inclined to agree with that assessment. You probably couldn't tell that by the quality of my gameplay, but then again, my personal rendition of Swan Lake wouldn't be too graceful either, so for both of our sakes, please just take my word for it. In capable hands, the gameplay can be an absolute marvel to behold. These are not those hands. This is not JonathanIsBadAtGames. My feelings on the game's elegance are actually a little complicated, because while the game was being advertised, the gameplay shown was of the game in some very capable hands. The clips were choreographed with a high degree of skill and generally showcased some of the crazier aspects of the game, like deflecting bullets off of a frying pan that you kicked into the air. I mean, that's pretty objectively cool as fuck. 9 out of 10 strict religious fundamentalists would have no choice but to hesitantly agree right down to the profanity through gritted teeth. But the problem is that it's too cool as fuck. It's too hype. Now that I've finally gotten to play it, I was a little let down. More specifically, it put itself in a very uncomfortable liminal space where it can be cool, but never quite as cool as you would have expected. Usually when something is advertised, you'd expect more of whatever it's advertising, but there are only so many times that shooting a frying pan can be unique or interesting. Eventually it just becomes a video game mechanic. That's not to say it didn't have any more exciting gimmicks or variety, it certainly did, but nothing quite hit the levels of excitement generated by that frying pan bit. Specifically the frying pan bit in the ads, because at that point you now anticipate it by the time the game rolls around, and thus the magic in the moment is lost. Does that make the game bad? Not really. It just doesn't live up to the exciting potential of the game that I imagined. It probably would have felt amazing if I had lower expectations. The controls also found a weird little niche where they weren't exactly complicated, but it didn't feel as fluid as the style of the game more or less demands. High adrenaline action necessitates easy controls that absolute noobs can pick up and use to some degree of competency. Games like Hotline Miami come to mind, where most of the gameplay is just using the arrow keys and then moving and pointing a cursor. The game doesn't have to be easy, but the process of getting into a flow state absolutely does. Unfortunately, I never found myself in a flow state. I kept forgetting to turn slow motion on or off. I'd keep using my dodge bullet skill when I meant to jump, and forgetting that it existed when I needed it most. While it's entirely possible to arrive at a proper flow state within My Friend Pedro, you first got to figure out how to circumnavigate the ways it steps on its own toes by accident. I think that's more or less a compromise in having to look outside of convention to fit a unique control scheme, but it's still worth mentioning. Another thing worth mentioning is the occasional bug, and by occasional I mean anytime a landmine pops up. They don't act as intended, which I only assume because they're inconsistent in literally every way. Sometimes you shoot them and they blow up, sometimes they're invulnerable to shots, sometimes they get stuck on walls, sometimes they go through walls, sometimes they get destroyed, but an explosion still happens miles away from where it died because that's where it intended to go. Sometimes it explodes more than once, even if destroyed before either of the explosions. Whenever you see one of those landmines, you know that you're in for a bad time, but despite all of that, I'd say that My Friend Pedro earns a respectable 7 out of 10. It sounds a little counterintuitive, but for all that it did wrong, it did a lot right. The controls weren't familiar, but the people that take the time to make them familiar show that they're serviceable. There might be a few bugs, but none that can stop someone who's not capable at games from making it all the way through with little resistance. It might not push the boundaries as much as you convinced yourself that it should, but it still strives to innovate and provide a wild ride of experiences, and it delivers. I'd even go so far as to recommend it to friends in spite of its glaring faults. My favorite thing about it is that it actually manages to capture such an off-the-wall energy without coming across as your run-of-the-mill random XD humor. It felt way less like my cringy middle school self and a lot more like the director of The Matrix, the writer of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and that guy that makes the ASDF movies, all sat in the same room and tripped on ayahuasca together. I wanted to hate it so much, but it was just too charming and I ended up loving it instead. The only thing I can say that I was truly disappointed not to see was a level creator for even more shenanigans, but hey, you can blow a guy up and kill his friend with his detached skull, so really what is there to complain about? Thank you everyone for watching, and special thanks to Dead Toast Entertainment for bringing this indie gem to life. And congrats for the most innovative gameplay award on Steam. I actually voted for it, believe it or not. I don't know if you're done with My Friend Pedro or not, but I look forward to seeing what else you come up with in the future. So until then, remember that failure is not the worst case scenario, to glow on with your bad selves, and stay awesome.